Later, when the storm has passed, everyone will talk about the destruction it left behind, though no one, not even the king himself, will remember that it all began with a single raindrop. Hello, I'm Elif Shafak, and I'm here to discuss my book, There Are Rivers in the Sky, which was chosen to be featured on the Queen's Reading Room Book Club. There Are Rivers in the Sky is the story of three characters who might seem to be very, very different from each other at first glance because they live in different parts of the world or different historical periods, but they are connected, hopefully in a surprising way. And then two rivers, the River Thames, which very much shapes our lives here in London and beyond, and the River Tigris or Tigris in the Middle East, and then one ancient poem, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh. So 3, 2, 1, and everything in this book is connected via a tiny single drop of water. The canvas of this novel is quite broad or epic, if I may say, but the truth is, the story didn't come to me with any grand ideas or anything like that. Everything started actually with a very small idea, a tiny raindrop that landed on my hand one day as I was walking by the River Thames. And I was looking at this raindrop and thinking, can I tell its story? It felt almost like a spiritual question, maybe the same question that William Blake had asked about a grain of sand. So that tiny raindrop brought me to the subject of rivers. And once I knew I was going to write about rivers, that brought me to the Epic of Gilgamesh. Therefore, about the structure of the book, all I can say is it grew organically. And once I knew that I was going to have three characters, I had to start weaving, almost like a braid, every single thread simultaneously. I had these notebooks full of crazy, scribbled notes. And I love that entire process. But my point is, everything grew from that tiny raindrop. The research behind this book has been quite intense, very interdisciplinary, and to be honest, a little bit insane. I had to read so many books about a whole variety of subjects and issues, but not only reading, I think listening is also a big part of a novelist's life. I've always believed that we have to be good readers, by which I mean we have to be avid, curious readers, just read across the board. But then we also need to be good listeners and try to listen to people, what they're saying, and with what kind of emotions they're saying what they're saying. We have a lot of learning to do as we get older, all of us, and sometimes we have to do a bit of unlearning as well, in the sense that all of us, without knowing, we internalize biases, prejudices about each other. So unlearning is also a big part of learning process. But what I can tell you is, after that very intense and long period of research, I felt like I can now fly, I can now just follow my imagination. I'm ready to go wherever the imagination takes me. And from that moment onwards, there's no more research, no more reading. You just follow the flow of the art of storytelling. The three main characters in this book, I see them like atoms in a water molecule, like the H2O. And at the center is the oxygen, which for me is a character called Arthur. In the book, I call him King Arthur of the sewers and the slums. There's a reason why he's given this unusual name. This fictional character is loosely based on an actual historical person, and I find him fascinating, really, George Smith. We don't know much about his childhood or his youth, but what we do know is that he was born into severe poverty. I think had he been alive today, we would have recognized the beauty of his mind and the neurodivergence of his brain and respected that very much. But of course, at the time, he gets no such recognition, no proper education. And purely by coincidence, he comes to the British Museum. He sees these broken tablets, but I'm talking about thousands and thousands of almost shards with cuneiform on them, scripture on them. And he starts little by little piecing them together. This is the person who decoded the flat tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. He came to the Middle East to find the missing lines in the poem. He lost his life there. He was buried in an almost forgotten graveyard between Turkey and Syria. So I think a part of me wanted to honor this very unusual working class genius. That is the Arthur character in the book, and maybe it's going to sound odd, but I really, really fell in love with him as I kept writing or imagining a journey, a past, a childhood for him. Equally, though, I felt very drawn to the other two characters. We have Nareen, who is a young Yazidi girl, and she lives in a not easy geography. She and her grandmother are journeying from Turkey to Iraq. And unfortunately, this is the summer of 2014 when ISIS fanatics launched horrific attacks against the Yazidi minorities. So that part of the book was emotionally not easy to write, and it required a very different style. As I was writing Arthur, I tried to stick to a much more Dickensian language, Victorian. As I was writing Nareen, it was oral storytelling because the Yazidi culture is mostly based on oral storytelling. So there are more dialogues in that part of the book. And then the third character is Zeliha, who is a child of immigrants. She lives in London. She lives on a houseboat. At the beginning of the book, she's going through a rough period. And so she goes on a personal journey of her own. So she's a water scientist, and she studies not only seen rivers, but also the unseen ones. As you know, the biggest rivers on this planet are the invisible ones, in the sense that there are atmospheric rivers above our heads. We never think about them usually, but they're there. And then there are so many buried rivers under our feet. What we did as humanity is, as we built our cities, we considered some rivers insignificant or too dirty, too filthy, unnecessary, and we covered them. We built entire roads and buildings above them. So our city, London, is very much shaped by them, but so is Paris, Tokyo, Stuttgart. I mean, in every continent you find lost rivers. What is happening right now is, with the climate crisis accelerating and the sea levels rising, that system is not sustainable anymore. And we are seeing more and more flash floods in our cities. So all around the world, there's an awareness right now that talks about bringing buried rivers into daylight, and it's called daylighting. There are very successful examples of this in South Korea, for instance. So I became very interested in water science as I kept writing this book, but also as a novelist, I am very intrigued by that concept of daylighting, because as a writer, I'm drawn not only to stories, but also to silences. So a part of me wants to know what else remains buried in our lives, in our societies. Can we gently bring them into daylight and face what has been buried or lost, and make progress from that moment onwards? I'm very interested in the question of memory and amnesia. And I'm also interested in how we perceive time. I believe storytelling time is very different than clock time. We tend to assume that time is a linear, steady, progressive march, that by definition today is more developed than yesterday, and therefore tomorrow is going to be even more developed. We want to believe that the arc of history will bend towards justice, but all of that is a perception. It's in our minds. It is not like that necessarily. And in fact, when we follow history, we find lots of echoes, maybe not exact repetitions, but those echoes are there. And I've always been interested in this difference between chronos, as in the time of chronology, and kairos, as in deeper time. And then there's storytelling time, which makes the connections. This is a book that tries to join the dots. But this doesn't come from my rational mind. I don't sit down at my desk and I say to myself, I want to join the dots. It comes to me organically because of who I am, what my life has been. It has always been a bit nomadic, more intercultural, interdisciplinary. So I am interested in the kind of stories that try to show the connections. There's a beautiful passage by Umberto Eco. He says, you don't have to invent the connections. All you have to do is to see them. And I think that's what a novelist tries to do, Everything and everyone in this universe is connected. Our stories, our lives, our pasts, our futures, they are connected. So I think it's a writer's job to try to see those connections. When I look at my own life, I was raised by two women, my mother and my grandmother. My mom was a single working mother. At the time, that was a bit unusual in the environment that I grew up in. And my grandmother, she was a storyteller in her own way. And her house was full of superstitions, stories. I think she taught me to pay attention to oral culture. I would love it if my fiction, to the best of my ability, could be a bridge builder between oral culture and written culture and the storytelling traditions of different cultures, different continents. As I was writing There Are Rivers in the Sky, I spent time with Yazidi grandmothers, and I tried to listen to their stories because this is also a culture that is mostly based on oral storytelling. So most of the memory of this community is passed on via stories, lullabies, riddles, tales, and so on. And one thing that I noticed was how the grandmothers would advise little children who would be running around to run more gently in the month of April, to walk the earth much more softly and respectfully in the month of April. Why? Because according to their belief, to their worldview, in the month of April, the earth is pregnant. Now, to our maybe rational mind, this might sound like an irrational thing to say, but only a culture that has not cut off itself from nature, only a culture that has not situated itself above nature will come up with such a gentle philosophy. So a part of me wants to learn from these ancient teachings. I love reading, ancient stories, poetry. And I also think about my own grandmother, because in her own world, when you listen to her, trees had a voice, water said something, rivers told us something, and we just had to be better listeners to hear what they were saying. In many ways, the story of water is the story of our times. When we talk about climate crisis, we're basically talking about either the abundance or the scarcity of water. All around the world right now, maybe the irony is, as sea levels are rising, as we are having flash floods in our major cities, in the midst of all this, there isn't enough water to drink. And that is the story, unfortunately, could be the story of the future as well. We might start seeing water wars. We have to pay more attention to water. And right now, out of the most 10 water-stressed nations in the world, 7 are in the Middle East and in North Africa. What that means is our rivers are dying. They're drying up. This has massive consequences for everyone, but particularly for women, children, for the poor. Women, usually in traditional societies, are water carriers. They bring water to their communities. When there's no drinkable water nearby, the distance that a young woman has to walk increases, unfortunately also increasing the possibility for sexual violence. The reason why I mention this is because in our minds, we like to put things in separate drawers or categories. We say, okay, this is the box for climate crisis, and people who are interested in this subject should open that box. Or this is the box for water scarcity. That's a more niche subject, we think. Or here's a box for women's rights, another box for racial inequality, and so on. But in life, there are no boxes. There are no drawers. Everything is connected. So writing about a single raindrop taught me this, helped me to see this. I think I was also surprised to learn that water behaves in such surprising ways that we don't quite yet understand. And we need more research, more scientists, and maybe philosophers looking into the story of water, because it very much shapes who we are today and who we might become tomorrow. I do think about the concept of identity a lot. But for me, identity is not a solid, monolithic, unchanging, pre-given block. Actually, there were several ancient Greek philosophers who thought of identity in much more fluid terms, like ripples in water, or perhaps like the circles you find inside a tree bark, right? Or inside a tree trunk. Just like that, I think it's very normal, it's beautiful that we feel a very strong sense of attachment to our own family, our own friends, that inner circle so close to our hearts. And maybe another circle would be, let's say, the people who live on our street, another circle, the people who live in our neighborhood, in our city, then in our country. We feel very attached to them, of course we do. But then a whole continent, and it goes on and on like this. It expands and expands, so that the outer circle is one single humankind, one single human race. And if we can connect these circles, so if we can care both about the inner circle, the local, the one that's closest to us, but also care about humanity at the same time, I really think there would be less conflict in this world. Whereas what we are being told constantly is that we all belong in separate boxes and we must remain in those boxes once and for all. I disagree, I think the other way of thinking about identity or belongings in a much more fluid and multiple way is actually closer to our truths. And maybe no one said this better than Walt Whitman. He mentioned how we all, as human beings, we all contain multitudes inside. We're living in a time of deep anxiety right now. Everybody is so anxious, young and old, east and west. And maybe the only difference is some people hide their emotions more than others. That's the only difference. But when you scratch the surface a little bit, underneath those very polished social media facades, there's a lot of anxiety. Many people are struggling, confused. It's not an easy age that we're living in. And for me, it feels like there are three major connections that we need to renew or rebuild. So the first connection is the human-to-human connection. We have to connect with our fellow human beings beyond borders, beyond boxes. The second connection that I find so crucial is the one we build with nature. We are not above nature. We like to think that we are the most cleverest species. We turned ourselves into consumers of nature, and we got disconnected from nature. I think that's a big mistake. So we're not outside or above nature. Sometimes when you sit under a tree, it really helps you to calm down. When you walk by a river and think about all the stories that that river has seen, it puts things into perspective. So we have a lot to learn from nature itself. And often I think trees are much more sentient than we recognize. And nature shows us how everything is connected. And the third connection that I find important is the inner one. I don't have a name for that. Some people call it spirituality. Other people call it meditation. I really don't know what to call it. Voltaire used to call it the inner garden. I think I'm going to follow Voltaire's footsteps and call it the inner garden. We all have an inner garden that we are responsible for, and we need to take good care of that as well. So if we can build these three layers of connections, it might be better for ourselves, for our communities, for humanity as a whole, I hope, yeah. I think we're living in the age of 3 A's: anxiety, anger, and AI. But if this were to become the age of 4 A's, it would be a much more difficult world to live in. What I mean by that is when apathy is added into the equation. The moment we become numb, the moment we become desensitized, indifferent to each other's sorrows, to each other's stories, the moment we stop caring, and the moment we stop connecting. So what literature does, and it does this very gently but passionately, it connects us. It helps us to care. When we read a novel for a few hours, for a few days, we leave our own little corners of the universe and we journey into the psychology, into the psyche of another human being and look at the world through their eyes and feel what they feel. This is an incredibly humbling exercise for the ego, for the soul. And I think we need to make this journey as often as we can. I always feel sad when some people tell me, well, I read about important things because so much is happening in the world, so I read about economy, history, philosophy. I don't have time for fiction. I think inside fiction, there is history, there is philosophy, there is neuroscience, there is technology. So whatever is part of life can be and is part of fiction. But there's something in addition to that. Inside a novel, inside the literary imagination, there's emotional intelligence. We live in an age in which emotions guide and misguide everything. I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their own emotions or make better sense of other people's emotions. So emotional intelligence is incredibly important. And then there's another distinction that I find important. I'm following the footsteps of T.S. Eliot here. He makes a distinction between information, knowledge, and wisdom. I think we live in an age in which we have way too much information, but little knowledge and even less wisdom. So what literature does is help us gently to access wisdom, not snippets of information which we can't process because we're bombarded by them, but wisdom that connects the heart and the mind. We need more of that. And if I may give you an example, we've been talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. We're talking about a poem that is at least 4,000 years old. And imagine, let us remember that before it was written down on clay tablets by scribes, it was passed down via oral culture. So grandmothers or grandfathers telling the story, the poem, to their grandchildren. This is how it has survived for such a long time, which means that the poem is actually much, much older than we know. And then I like to think this, ask myself about this. Ever since the poem was told and then written down, so many empires have come and gone. So many kings, very strong, men, rulers have perished. And even the tallest architectural structures have crumbled to dust. But a poem made of breath and made of words has survived the tides of history. And here we are, 4,000 years later, reading that poem, learning from that poem, and feeling inspired by it. So to me, it shows that literature has a very quiet, gentle, but very, very profound power to change minds, to touch hearts, and it really transcends all boxes of identity, time, and geography. I'm an introvert, and like many writers are probably, my natural habitat is a small room full of books. I feel very much at home there, and I can stay in that space happily for long stretches of time. The public space is not easy for me. And yet, at the same time, I genuinely love, cherish, and enjoy literary festivals, cultural spaces, talking about books. It's almost as if you're using a different part of your brain, and a part of me appreciates those moments so much. Even as the introvert in me wants to go back to that small room. That said, I also believe that we need to hear women's voices more in the public space. We need to hear the voices of younger people. We need to give them more space. Also, we need to hear the voices of minorities in the public space, so diversify the conversation. And on top of that, I genuinely believe that we need the humanities, arts, literature. These are the areas where you will find bridge builders. And in a world that is as divided, as polarized as ours, I really think our need for literature is as existential, as deep as our need for bread and water and air. When I finish writing a novel, I feel so depressed. I don't feel a sense of triumph or in anything. Of course, a part of me is happy that I was able to maybe conclude the story, but I find it so hard to let go of the characters. I know it sounds very irrational, and it probably is, but those characters become my friends, and that imaginary world becomes my reality. I try to stay in that space, imaginary space, as long as I can, as deep as I can. And so the moment you hand it to your editor, of course, it doesn't end there, because you work closely with your editor, with the copy editor. There's a teamwork, and I'm very grateful. The book designers, all of that is, my heart is full of gratitude for the people I work with. But the life of a writer is a very lonely one. It's based on solitude. And so really, really, those imaginary characters become your companions. And then when you have to say goodbye to them, I find that moment very, very painful. Once the book is out, it belongs to the reader. I don't usually write sequels. I have a lot of respect for authors who do that. But I've never done that. So it's always in my mind the next journey that I think I feel drawn to. But when a book is out, it really, really belongs to the readers. And I find it fascinating that a couple who have been, let's say, married for 45 years, I've met such couples, they read the same book, they don't read it in the same way. Maybe one of them loves it, the other one not so much. Or two friends who share everything, every little secret. They read the same book, they share the same copy, but they feel attached to different characters for completely different reasons. I love that too. What I'm trying to say is, I think our readings are unique, like our fingerprints. The reader is never, ever passive. And we create the meaning together, the writer, the story, and the reader. We meet. And therefore, I respect that different readers will enjoy the same story in a completely different way, experience it in a completely different way. I think a writer's job is not to try to give answers. I find it very off-putting when writers try to preach or lecture or teach. I don't know the answers myself. We're all learning, But the only thing I know is that I care about the questions so much, including difficult questions. So if I can create a space of freedom, multiplicity, plurality, nuance, empathy, bring those questions or buried rivers to the fore, and then you take a step back. You have to let the readers come up with their own answers, and I have to respect that diversity. There Are Rivers in the Sky is available from all good bookshops and your local library. Do subscribe to the Queen's Reading Room for more bookish content.